Welcome back. All right, so how about a redraft for your Saturday or whatever day you're watching this? So 1987, picks 1 through 21. You'll notice that the Quebec Nordiques had 2 picks. They had one from Washington that they'd acquired for Dale Hunter that they used to draft Joe Sakic. Interestingly enough, number 9 was Brian Fogarty. Sadly, his career was cut short. But yeah, those are the 2 picks for Quebec. I'm wearing Boston because they had the Glenn Wesley pick from Vancouver in the Cam Neely trade, and then drafted Stefan Quintal. So they did a good job of getting their blue line together. LA and Minnesota switched spots, and neither of them draft guys who are going to be shown in this video as being redrafted. Both Dave Archibald and Wayne McBean. Archibald from Chilliwack, and last I heard, still in Chilliwack. At any rate, we've also got the Whalers on the board here drafting Jody Hull. Let's go ahead and start things off with Buffalo. Now, Buffalo did well. They draft Pierre Turgeon. But Pierre Turgeon does not go number 1 in the redraft. Number 1 in the redraft, also a Hall of Famer, kind of has to be the number 1 guy, and that's Joe Sakic. This is where I tell Nordiques and Avalanche fans, don't worry, it's just Buffalo drafting Sakic in a redraft, and it doesn't have any effect on actual history. I can't create timelines with redrafts. Be interesting if I did. Anyways, Joe Sakic going first overall. Originally, as I stated, was drafted 15th. And so, yeah, Sakic would have been great for the Buffalo Sabres for a very long time. Number 2 stays exactly the same. So number 2, originally, the New Jersey Devils draft Brendan Shanahan. I think Shanahan still goes second in this draft. Of course, he would end up going to St. Louis, and then Scott Stevens ends up in New Jersey. So it's not like Shanahan became a Hall of Famer due to his play in New Jersey. But his play overall tells me, yeah, that's where he has to go. He has to go to 2. So, number 3, Boston's pick that they got from Vancouver. And that is where Pierre Turgeon lands. Now, it's interesting because Glenn Wesley had a very good career. He did. But if Boston takes Pierre Turgeon here, and they already have Neely, yeah, that would have been just ridiculous. But again, Wesley had a very good long career, most of it with Boston. And so, yeah, Turgeon going at 3 is how things turn out. So you have 3 Hall of Famers at the top of this draft. It's the reason I picked the 87 draft, also looking for ones I hadn't done yet. At 4th, players not in the Hall of Fame. He was originally drafted 38th overall. Did a career video on him just last week. Eric Desjardins. Eric Desjardins, of course, drafted by Montreal at 38th. Ends up playing a majority of his career in Philadelphia after an ill-advised trade by Montreal. Eric Desjardins, an excellent defenseman. You add him to that blue line in LA. Who knows how things might have been different in that 1993 final if you take Desjardins off Montreal, you put him in Los Angeles. Yeah, we'll never know. But hey, Desjardins becomes the first defenseman on the board at 4. At 5, originally drafted 166th overall. And drafted 5th overall by Pittsburgh, Theoren Fleury. Explosive, offensive player who had a lot of productive seasons in the National Hockey League. A lot of talk about him not being in the Hall of Fame. Same as I would say that there would be around Eric Desjardins too. Because I've seen, on that Desjardins video, I saw a Flyers fan saying, hey, best defenseman the Flyers ever had. Fleury, of course, his small stature would have caused him to drop in the draft. But he was a key part of a Calgary team that was really good in the late 80s, early 90s. At number 6, and moving up from number 33, where he was originally drafted by Montreal, John LeClair. So instead of Dave Archibald, it's John LeClair going to the Minnesota North Stars. That would have looked weird. But if you have LeClair and then you have Modano, and anyways, LeClair, of course, had a good run with Montreal, but then he gets traded to Philadelphia and is absolutely fantastic. So 2 Montreal Canadian players who end up going to Philadelphia and having greater success, and Desjardins and LeClair going in the top 6 in this draft. Which brings us to number 7. Number 7, moving up from 44. Montreal had a good draft, didn't they? This was a good draft for them. So instead of Luke Richardson going at 7 to the Toronto Maple Leafs, it's Matthew Schneider, who, as I remember, it did end up playing for Toronto as well. Schneider got around the league. He played for a lot of teams. I think it was 9 or 10 different teams he played for. Schneider, good, solid defenseman, so he's the second defenseman off the board and would have provided a lot to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Not that Luke Richardson was a bad pick either. Richardson does end up appearing in this redraft, but Matthew Schneider at 7. Which brings us to number 8. Number 8's another defenseman. And I mean, I debated about whether or not to put him at 7th or 8th. But Glenn Wesley ends up going at number 8 to the Chicago Blackhawks. Chicago drafts Jimmy Waite, a goaltender, at the number 8 spot. Waite had a couple of seasons that showed some potential, but ultimately did not play that long in the National Hockey League, and can be used as an example of why teams don't like to draft goaltenders early. There's a lot of risk. There is, of course, that reward. We look at the goaltenders that are drafted late that do quite well, and we say, how could they have slipped? But I get why GMs are nervous about drafting goaltenders early. Goaltenders usually take longer to develop, and they're very unpredictable. So Glenn Wesley going to Chicago. He had a very long, solid career in the National Hockey League. Number 9. Number 9, there it is. Going to the Quebec Nordiques. Andrew Castles. Andrew Castles, an underrated player in his era. I thought he was a great passer. I remember when he was in Vancouver, I was so upset he left Vancouver. I thought Castles had a ton of talent, and yeah, he started out in Montreal as well. So Montreal really represented in this top 10. And you can kind of understand how they end up winning the 93 Stanley Cup with some of the players on this board being a part of that. But yeah, Andrew Castles had a good, solid career. I don't think I've done a career video on Andrew Castles. I do need to do that at some point. But he ends up at number 9 instead of Brian Fogarty going to the Quebec Nordiques. Number 10 was Jason Moore. It's not going to be Jason Moore. Moving up from the number 110 spot where he was originally drafted, I believe, by LA. Sean McEachern. Sean McEachern had a good career. I remember he played well in Pittsburgh, and then he left Pittsburgh, and then he ended up going back to Pittsburgh. He was good in Pittsburgh. He had struggles elsewhere. But McEachern, good player, complimentary forward, could play top 6 minutes as well, and ends up in the top 10. So it's a solid top 10 overall. You've got your top 6 forwards, your top 2 and top 4 defensemen. But yeah, and of course your 3 Hall of Famers at the top of the board, and others in the top 10 that people will make the argument should be in the Hall. Number 11 on the board, another goaltender moving up from 159th. Or a goaltender moving up from 159th, sorry. Just I was talking about Jimmy Waite, so. Guy Hebert. Guy Hebert ends up moving all the way up to number 11 for Detroit. Hebert was interesting because he was St. Louis's backup, and then in the expansion draft he ends up going to Anaheim. Had a really good run with Anaheim. Hebert, if you want to talk about underrated goaltenders during their era, Hebert would be on that list for me. Really good stats overall. Gave Anaheim exactly the kind of goaltending that they needed right away as an expansion team. And in the redraft here, he ends up in Detroit. Yeah, Detroit could have used that goaltending in the late 80s. Absolutely. And into the early 90s as well. Of course, eventually they get Mike Vernon, and the rest is history. Back-to-back cups and everything. But Guy Hebert would have been a solid addition for them. Number 12, another goaltender moving up from 34th to number 12. And it's not Keith Osborne, just like Yves Racine was not going number 11 to Detroit. But in this case, it is Jeff Hackett. Hackett had bad luck. Hackett had bad luck in that he was usually playing for teams that weren't necessarily very good. So if you look at his win-loss record, it often was not great. But as a goaltender, Jeff Hackett was excellent. So he moved around the league a lot, but he was a very good goaltender. Never heard any complaints from Hackett when he was on a team that wasn't playing well. But so yeah, he ends up in St. Louis. St. Louis, the late 80s, you're looking at Riondo, Cujo would be a part of that team. St. Louis, pretty steady net minding throughout their existence, and adding Jeff Hackett. I don't think Hackett played for the Blues. I'm not remembering Hackett playing for the Blues. I know he played a lot for the Hawks. But yeah, Hackett in this ends up with St. Louis at number 12. At number 13, 13th on the board, moving down from number 7. And Dean Chenoweth is the number 13 pick for the Islanders originally. But in this redraft, it is going to be Luke Richardson. Luke Richardson played a long time in the NHL. put up a lot of penalty minutes, not scared about dropping his gloves if he was challenged. And now he's a head coach, and he's a good head coach, and he waited a long time to become a head coach. Richardson was a leader on and off the ice, and so I think at 13 that's a good spot for him. He was never an offensive defenseman on any level, but he was a good defensive defenseman, again, willing to drop the gloves, and was in the NHL for a very long time. Number 14 for Boston, I'm picking a guy who was a Boston Bruin anyways, which is Ted Donato. Donato was originally drafted at 98th. He moves up to 14th. Is related to Ryan Donato, obviously. And Ted Donato had a good career, not dissimilar from the one that's currently being put together by Ryan Donato. I did like Donato for Boston in the early 90s. And so, yeah, Ted, good player. Never really a first-line guy, never a huge point producer, but still at 14 you're getting a solid player. At 15, moving up from 18 and being drafted by Quebec. And I'm just going to say straight out, Jody Hall had some good years, but definitely not a replacement for Joe Sakic. So in this draft, instead of coming out of it with Brian Fogarty and Joe Sakic, Quebec comes out with Andrew Castles and Jody Hall. NHL players, yes, but obviously Joe Sakic being the number one guy in the draft. Best player in the draft and all that. Really good scouting by Quebec to take Sakic. But then the question can, I think, rightfully be asked of, but why didn't they take Sakic at 9? So if they had known what Sakic was going to become, I would think they would have taken Sakic at 9. Even though Fogarty had a very good junior career and was a highly thought of prospect going into that draft. Number 16, the Winnipeg Jets. And dropping down from 14 to 16. So defenseman on the board here. And that's Stefan Quintal. So, defensive defenseman, check. Played a lot of years in the NHL, check. And could provide some solid depth / top 4 minutes for Winnipeg if he'd been drafted by them. Also a check mark there. So, Marchment becomes Quintal. I take Quintal instead of Marchment in this draft. Marchment, though, does show up. In fact, he shows up next. Number 17, defenseman going to Montreal is Brian Marchment. Marchment was very controversial during his time in the NHL. He had numerous hits and plays that were a little over the line or rode that line between, being a really good hit or being potentially suspendable. But Marchment played a long time in the NHL as well. So Castles was originally taken 17th by Montreal. In this draft, I have them taking Brian Marchment instead. So they lose Castles. Instead of going 17th, he goes 9 to Quebec. So they lose him to their provincial rival. Marchment goes at 17. Would have been interesting to see Marchment on that Montreal defense. Again, going back to 93 and looking at the team they had there. Marchment did bounce around the league a bit, though. And I don't know if it would have mattered who drafted him. He probably still would have been traded around a lot. Number 18, going to forward. Stefan Matteau, drafted by Hartford instead of Jody Hall, who moved up to 15th. Stefan Matteau, good player. Didn't have as long of a career as some of the guys ahead of him on the board here. Has had more games than the Stefan Matteau that's currently on a tryout for Columbus, I believe. But at any rate, Stefan Matteau goes 18th to the Hartford Whalers in this draft, who again, Jody Hall ends up moving up to 15th on the board in this one. Number 19, moving up from 105th in the draft. So Brian Deasley was originally drafted 19th overall by Calgary. I'm having them draft Sean Van Allen, a 3rd/4th line center, who, as I remember, was pretty good on faceoffs. A lot of debate towards the end of his career about how useful he was and where he was going to play. But Van Allen played in the league for around 10 years, as I remember it. I remember it gets a little foggy at my age, but I'm going to have Sean Van Allen taken at 19th by the Calgary Flames. Then Philadelphia at 20th, moving up from 118th. Role player, but you need role players. Rob DeMaio ends up going at 20th instead of Darren Rumble. Darren Rumble does not end up getting taken in the first round of the draft. Rob DeMaio does, and ends up at 20th on the board, which brings us to 21st. And 21st, I went back and forth. So honorable mention to Mike Eastwood, who has the exact same amount of points in almost the exact same amount of games as the guy that I'm going to put on the board. However, I'm having the Oilers draft Gary Volk at 21. Gary Volk, role player through most of his career, played third line at stages, played fourth line as well. And so I give Volk like a very small edge over Mike Eastwood on this board. And he goes 21st to the Oilers instead of Peter Soberlack. So the Oilers picking up Gary Volk. Of course, the Oilers won the Cup in '87. That's the reason they drafted 21st. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.